streaming to the world. Buenas tardes, buenos días a todos y a todas. Agradezco mucho a quienes se están sumando a este seminario, donde tendremos a la profesora Carla Ucamau presentando sobre el modelo. Agradezco también la flexibilidad a todo el equipo de la Universidad de O'Higgins y también a las personas que se están sumando con este cambio de planes tan encima de la hora. De verdad agradezco mucho su disponibilidad y su presencia. La profesora Carla Ucamau nos está visitando de Nueva Zelanda. Ella es profesora en el Departamento de Gestión y Negocios Internacionales de la Universidad de Auckland. Es un gusto tenerla con nosotros y nosotras hoy. Para quienes van a asistir, si quieren ir dejando algunas preguntas, siéntanse libres y cómodos de hacerlo en su lengua de preferencia. Si quieren escribir en castellano, yo y Joaquín Bahamondes podremos traducir para Carla. Y si quieren también levantar la mano, hacer alguna pregunta directamente, siéntanse libres para eso. Carla, ¿alguien está? Ya. Eso. Carla, thank you so much for being with us today and also for being so flexible about this change of plans. We welcome you in Chile, even though you're quarantined and can't really enjoy our country, but we honestly thank you for being here and for giving this amazing talk. We are really looking forward to hearing
gracias, Anna, and thank you so much for your very kind invitation to present today. And I came all the way to Chile to present from a hotel room, but that is the modern world today. I'm really honoured to be invited to the Instituto de Ciencias Sociales, Universidad de O'Higgins, Chile. So the only bit I felt confident pronouncing there was O'Higgins, because I'm actually part Irish as well as Māori. So as you mentioned, I'm at the University of Auckland. We're also called Waipapa Taumatarau now. There's a Māori name for the university that was recently gifted to the University of Auckland from Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, which is the local tribe of the Auckland area. And I'm a professor in the Department of Management and International Business. I actually have a background in social psychology. So my thinking here and my presentation, which really covers my research, which spans over 15 years now, comes from that social psychological perspective, but also from my own identity as Māori. I have three Māori iwi I descend from, Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu, and Ngai Tahu. But I also descend from Irish settlers as well that came to New Zealand in the early days of colonisation. So I've always been very fascinated in the relationships in New Zealand, but how that shapes contemporary Māori identity. And the presentation, which is on the multidimensional model of Māori identity and cultural engagement, is really a way of operationalizing the measurement of a very complex thing, Māori identity, which, many would say you can't wrestle into a measure. However, I think of it as a way of understanding differences and patterns in the ethnic group Māori. So I'll just talk to you initially about our research group and acknowledging various people. And Joaquin, you're going to see yourself here in a minute. Where are we? Sorry. I wanted to recognise various people in the research group. My current research group is Te Rangahau Tuakiri Māori Minga Wairo Putia, which is a Māori Identity and Financial Attitude Study group. And in that group, one of our original partners, he's now deceased, is Professor Manu Kahinari. You can see him up by me here. And we also have collaborator at Waikato University, Jason Mika, and a very good friend and close collaborator who's a joint lead on this project actually is Professor Chris Sibley. And we also, so I can't see my whole screen, but we'll see. We also have another colleague, Kerry Dell, who is also from the same tribe as me, and another colleague, Jamie Nuth, who's from Ngāpuhi tribe in New Zealand. And I've got you down there as well, Joaquim, because you have also contributed to some of the team working on this. And if anyone is interested, I've got the website there, which shows our current research program and some of the work that we're doing. There's also students as well, I haven't mentioned them all, but at the moment, Karina Martika is a PhD student working on the study with us. So it might be useful before I go into the details of the actual my study to talk a little bit about New Zealand history. So New Zealand was colonised by Europeans, British, from the 1840, and that involved the signing of a treaty. About 500 Māori chiefs signed the treaty on behalf of their tribes, and Queen Victoria sent representatives from the British Crown over to New Zealand to sign the treaty too. Now, there were two versions of the treaty, one in English and one in Māori. Most Māori people signed the Māori version. And in that version, they argued that they never ceded sovereignty to Britain. Rather, they agreed that Pākehā, which is the Māori word for New Zealand Europeans, could come to New Zealand and live alongside Māori. Now, that didn't really work out like that. Soon after the treaty was signed, thousands, tens of thousands of British immigrants poured into New Zealand, and it wasn't very long before Māori lost nearly all of their lands. About 2/3 of the lands were settlers in a very short period of time. And what that meant was that many things, Māori was separated from the land, and that meant that Māori increasingly became dependent on the new landowners and influenced by the primarily Pākehā government, the Pākehā government, to assimilate and integrate with this new culture. And the loss of an economic base also had a profound impact in that as Māori were forced off their lands, the tribes were broken up and they became more urbanized in kind of 1940s, 50s, 60s. And apart from that, there's very large percentage of intermarriage, or many Māori have now Pākehā parents as well. It's about 50% of the population have Pākehā parents. So I've kind of squished in a very 140 years of history into a short bit, but the main idea is that Māori were colonised, got integrated with this much larger colonising group, and Pākehā in New Zealand are around 70% of the population, and Māori are around 16% of the population. And of that Māori population, the majority are living in the urban areas, and about half of the population have got one Pākehā parent. So very, very heterogeneous group, contemporary Māori. And alongside that, there's been kind of phases in New Zealand history where Māori culture, Māori language, and Māori identity was pretty much ignored by the state. There's a lot of racism towards Māori. And in the last 40 years or so, there's been quite a significant impact of a political renaissance in New Zealand, whereby there's been an effort to revitalise Māori culture, recognise Māori rights under the original treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, and that's resulted in a number of different interventions through instruments of the state, including the education system. More recently, there's discussions of having a separate Māori health system, or an arm of the health system dedicated to Māori. And universities throughout New Zealand are increasingly required to recognise the Treaty of Waitangi. So it's quite an interesting socio-cultural context, which I think is very different from Chile, and that you've got this one large, reasonably homogenous, well, not homogenous, but one ethnic identity that's Indigenous Māori, large colonising group, and then a treaty which recognises Māori rights that the government is required to recognise. And that contemporary Māori identity is very different depending on who you ask. And within the group, you've got some Māori who are very connected to their traditional identity, their iwi, which is our tribes, and their hapu, their sub-tribes, grew up in rural environments, very confident in the Māori world. And then you've got another groups, which kind of, I'll split them in the middle, it's a bit of a kind of rough way of doing it, but another kind of group of Māori who are much less confident in their identity. So from the time that I started university, which was a long time ago now, I had come from a small Māori community in the Māori world. I grew up with my grandmother in a place called Prongaho, and I used to stay with her by our traditional meeting house there. I had lots of opportunity to be among traditional Māori cultural situations, hear Māori spoken. And when I moved to university, I was not really that aware that people had a different experience of being Māori until I started my PhD. My PhD was originally meant to look at health risk factors for sudden infant death syndrome among Māori families. But when I started talking to participants in my research, I found that they were most interested in talking about identity and how they just felt being Māori, how socialization experiences had shaped their sense of being Māori. And I ended up focusing on this for my PhD, and I looked at how three shaped by virtue of growing up at a certain socio-historical period in New Zealand. So I had kind of a much older group of Māori women who were over 65 at the time. I think the oldest was 81 or something. And most of these women had grown up pretty much quite isolated from Pākehā, really. They'd grown up in Māori communities, very, very confident in their Māori identity, very familiar with traditional Māori culture. And most of them spoke Māori, but none of them, they talk about racism, explicit racism when they're growing up, but none of them really spoke about like political issues or recognizing the Treaty of Waitangi. And then there was another middle group who were probably among the women that were the first to have been raised in urban environments and not have a lot to do with their traditional tribal history or families. And they'd grown up learning very, very little about Māori cultural history and didn't know much about their own whakapapa or what it meant to be Māori. They'd been socialised to really focus on just fitting into the dominant New Zealand culture so they could get good jobs and, you know, do well in life, do well. And then there was a much younger group of women who were born after the political renaissance of the 1970s and 80s. They were really politicized, and they were more likely to talk about Māori rights under the treaty, how important it is for us to understand our identity, how much it was important to them to speak Māori and so forth. So had these quite different experiences of identity depending on the decade that the women had been born in. When I did my PhD, there was very little, there was very little discussion of how identities might be different for people, for Māori. And there was an idea or a prevailing discourse in the literature that being Māori relates to being connected to traditional Māori culture. And in our culture, that means understanding your whakapapa, which is your genealogy, understanding your tribal connections, your hapu, being on the marae, the things that I had the privilege of learning about when I was growing up. But I knew that a lot of people in my study didn't have that understanding, and it made them feel inadequate. Assimilation. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to devise some kind of way of measuring how people relate to their Māori identity. So I met Professor Chris Sibley as part of my postdoc in 2007, 2008. And together, over a couple of years, we designed the survey, because he's a psychometrician and excellent at designing scales. And I had some training, but that wasn't really my background. I was more qualitative at that time. We designed a measure of Māori identity together, drawing on the literature for my PhD, but many of the quotes that I had been given in 35 interviews in my PhD research. So I had these statements from women about how they felt they were, identified as Māori. We were also asked to design a survey to start measuring the impact of a program for the Foundation of Youth Development that was designed at helping young people improve or gain confidence in their Māori identity. So we worked with them. And we trialed the survey, we published it online, we put the survey online and we tested the survey, and we found that there were these 6 different dimensions, and we found the statements on the scale that worked the most effectively from a statistical perspective. Through further research, we kept on getting funding at this point. We got quite a lot of internal funding from my university through an arts grant, as well as my internal school funding. And Chris also gave some funding from a Templeton grant that he had to the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study. He was able to draw on some of that funding as well to support this study. And we expanded the MICE to include an extra scale, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. And then more recently, in 2018, we were very, very fortunate to be able to get some funding from the Royal Society of New Zealand through a Marsden Fund, which is quite a prestigious grant in our funding in our country. And through that, we were able to do a really large nationwide survey where we captured responses from over 7,000 Māori. So by the time we got to 2018, we'd already had several thousand people complete the survey. So we kept on growing the numbers of respondents, testing the properties of the scale, and it actually got smaller and smaller over time because we were able to reduce it as well. So that's kind of the history of the scale. And I'll just show you what the scale comprises. We've got a number of different scales. We've got 6 in the versions, 47 items in the original version, and one of the scales is group membership evaluation. So that just measures the extent to which the respondent feels positive or negative towards the fact that they are Māori. So one of the statements is, I love the fact that I'm Māori. So these statements are meant to be statements that anyone can kind of grasp quite easily. And again, they're pretty much normal ways of talking about being Māori, not necessarily deeply academic statements or anything like that. It's meant to be a really accessible survey. Another one is cultural efficacy and active identity engagement. So that scale measures how confident people feel expressing themselves culturally as Māori, and also how much time and energy they spend in traditional Māori situations, like being at a marae, which is a traditional Māori meeting house, attending hui, being with your family, engaging in cultural activities or supporting each other, which are considered to be the traditional ways of expressing your culture as Māori. So normally, prior to some of the work that I've done, most of the discussion around Māori identity would just be looking at that cultural efficacy, so kind of how enculturated people are. We also measure interdependent self-concept. So that means the extent to which individuals see themselves as being Māori because they have a relationship with other people that recognise that, or their connection with other Māori people make them Māori or feel Māori. And that's because in Māori culture or the literature around Māori identity, they often talk about being Māori being a relational culture and a communal culture where you define it in terms of your relationship with other people. We also try to capture spiritual elements as well in the survey by asking individuals the extent to which they agree or disagree with some statements that point to traditional Māori notions of spirituality. So this is my favourite scale, actually. For example, one of the items is my taha wairua is an important part of my Māori identity. So that's my spiritual side, or my taha wairua spiritual side is an important part of being Māori. Another item on the scale asks them if they believe that they can speak to their ancestors if they want to, which is another thing that many Māori people believe that they can actually reach out to their tupuna, their ancestors, for help and guidance when they need that. The other thing is a socio-political consciousness, which is a really crucial aspect. Now we know, because we've asked thousands of people how they feel about this. Socio-political consciousness is a really kind of important aspect of the way that many Māori define Māori today. In fact, or see themselves as Māori. In fact, one of our quite preeminent academics, Tracy McIntosh, haven't got the exact date she said this, but she said that identifying as Māori is a political statement. In New Zealand, it's a choice because ethnicity is chosen in New Zealand for Māori. We don't have to necessarily apply to be recognised. You just, if you're recognised by your family, by your tribe as Māori, you're Māori, regardless of the way you express yourself culturally. So it's a kind of opt-in system. So socio-political consciousness means, or is a way of getting at people's commitment to that identity too, because it can be quite a political identity to be Māori in New Zealand, particularly when you're in a situation where there is now a lot of attention given to Māori rights. And in the university environment, for example, shortly we will see Māori researchers funded up to 3 times. Funding from the government will go to the university for Māori researchers. So there's an advantage to a very small minority in the university system. So, being aware of your Māori identity and claiming it is a bit of a statement these days. Well, it always has been, but it's important to tap into these things. So one of the items is on that is I stand up for Māori rights. Another item is this is a reverse item. We need to move on from history, that kind of thing. So we're trying to figure out if they're still committed to Māori rights. Authenticity beliefs, a funny scale, this one in a way, but it was an important scale to include. This is the extent to which individuals believe you have to be Māori a certain way. And this scale reflects some of the comments and also literature now that's emerging from some Māori that say that because they don't have the culture or the language, or they don't understand their genealogy very well, through no fault of their own, because of colonisation, they're made to feel that they don't fit into the Māori world, or they feel uncomfortable in Māori situations. So authenticity beliefs taps in to an individual's belief that you have to act a certain way or be a certain way to be Māori. Another couple of ones, we added some more. We added this perceived appearance scale because we were noticing that as we were gathering data, nearly always the people that identified as only Māori, had 2 Māori parents, had different outcomes in life compared to those that had 1 Māori parent. So that relates to how physically Māori looking you are. So we're trying to tap into discrimination based upon physical appearance. And my other work around racism and health and education also shows this quite clearly, that Māori that have got only Māori identity, they don't have a Pākehā parent, often report they get poorer treatment when they go to get health services and so forth. So it's actually a direct way of trying to tap into that. And often very high scores on that is related to higher self-reported racism. And the final one, which is not so much an identity marker per se, but it's an engagement aspect or an expression of Māori identity. And this is the whānau efficacy scale, which is family efficacy scale. And this one measures the extent to which individuals believe that their family has the resources required, including the ability to communicate and help each other effectively in order to solve problems should a family have to address them. And one of the reasons why we included that is because many of the policies that come out from the government now, and actually many just kind of, I guess, common knowledge about Māori identity and the literature and everything, points to the family unit as being absolutely crucial for Māori identity. It's the foundation of it. So we felt like if we wanted to tap into that, one way we could do that is to look at the extent to which families do play a role in supporting people in their well-being. So that's kind of scale, and we published it in the New Zealand Journal of Psychology in 2010, the first time. And from that time, it's been open for everyone to use it, and we started testing it more and more ourselves. So I thought what I'd do is just kind of run through a few papers that can illustrate how we use the scale and what it can show us. So this paper here, Māori Cultural Efficacy and Subjective Wellbeing, a Psychological Model and Research Agenda, we wanted to validate the scale by looking at scores and measure the scale outcomes with things that you would expect the scales to predict. So in this one, we were looking at the relationship between cultural efficacy and active identity engagement. So that's the confidence in expressing yourself as Māori, and the relationship between scores on that scale and satisfaction with life generally, personal relationships, well-being, and also your attitude towards the nation, how fair New Zealand society it is, and so forth. So this was quite a small sample, but we were able to show that the highest scores on cultural efficacy and identity engagement were related to highest scores on personal relationships and well-being. So feeling more satisfied with your personal relationships, high scores on personal well-being, but at the same time, they were related to lower satisfaction with the rest of society in various ways. So business, less likely to feel that New Zealand was a fair and equal country, and that the way that Māori governed in New Zealand were fair as well. So that was quite an interesting finding, and we hypothesised that perhaps Māori that were much more connected to their culture might be more acutely aware of injustice in New Zealand society, and therefore more likely to perceive a negative situation for Māori in New Zealand. Okay, this one. So this one here is where we wanted to test more some of the items on the scale, and we had a larger sample of this one. So we tested the first version of the mice, the 47 scale, 47 item version, and we found that aspects of Māori identification tend to be higher among older Māori. So the older age group tend to score higher on all of the scales, and those effects were similar for men and women. But I actually can't say. We actually found that political consciousness kind of peaks. So I'm going like this because I'm looking at my own notes down here. Peaks at around 50, 55 and starts to go down. And cultural efficacy for women increases steadily, and there's kind of a more of a curve for men going up. There's another one on here that I haven't got it on here, that shows that men become more concerned with relationships as they get older, and women's tend to go down over time. So there's a gender difference there. Okay, so this one here, we tested, I mentioned the physical appearance subscale, and we wanted to see, the extent to which different levels of self-reported appearance as Māori might predict negative impacts such as racism, experiences to racism. So one of the kind of major, I'm going to go down to this looking Māori, but one of the papers, which I think showed that the most clearly, is we found that Māori that had the higher self-reported physical appearance. So they said that just by looking at them, you could tell that they were Māori, and they felt that they looked extremely Māori. They were more likely to say that they were less likely to have a home loan approved in New Zealand, and that was controlling for, compared to Māori that had lower scores in that. That's controlling for everything that you might think would influence your eligibility to get a home loan. So your income, your education, whether you're employed or not. So the only thing that was different was physical appearance. So that got a lot of media attention, a lot of pushback in New Zealand from the New Zealand Banking Federation. Was really clear, and we argued that racism could possibly be an issue. Housing is a major issue in our country. There's a lot of homelessness, and Māori are much less likely to own their own home in New Zealand. So just a few more papers. This one here, kind of a little bit more of a positive note. We were starting to look at, what are the good things that we can predict using these measures. So we found that cultural efficacy is related to higher self-esteem, that cultural efficacy, higher scores on that, feeling more confident in your culture, means that you're more likely to report that you've got lower levels of psychological distress. And also, this was a good one, the cultural connection predicts perceptions of financial security for me. I'm not saying the paper was good, but it was a good one for me because it was the paper that gave me the inspiration for the larger study. But you can see here, we've been really lucky. I'll point to some of the names on these slides. It's actually been students that have picked up the scale, and they've done the research themselves as part of their own master's thesis, which has been wonderful because, it's kind of opened up that resource for them, and also provide an opportunity for them to work with data sets as well, and often try quantitative research, because Māori researchers tend to be qualitative, but it's opened up that kind of pathway for them as well. So just on that last one, the cultural connection paper, what we found is that Māori that have high scores on cultural connection tended to say that they had higher security or future financial security, even if they didn't have any superannuation savings. So what that meant to us was that Māori were actually investing in relationships as a form of future financial security. And I've recently done some work with a Tongan student. She did her master's in this area. And she found the same with Tongan communities. They spend a huge amount of time gifting to each other. They donate to the church. They share resources among themselves, and much less likely to have their own personal savings. Māori traditionally like this too, share resources, but don't think about putting it away for themselves. So we found that, the higher connection to culture, the less likely to, feel the need or perhaps even have the resources to save for the future. So that really inspired the next stage of the research, which is the MIFA study, which I'll get to in a moment. Just thought I'd show, this is a little bit wonky, but this is one of the websites that we used in 2015. This was funded by Ngā Pae Te Maramatanga. And what people could do is they could go online and they could fill the survey out. And then we used to produce this identity report thing. So they could see how they scored on all the scales compared to everybody else that had filled out the survey before. So we actually got a lot, we had ethics to do this, obviously, and we collected the data and used it. We got thousands of people fill out the survey this way, and it was cost effective too, because we didn't have much money at that point. And that was the research team at the time. You can see Chris down there, there's me a few years ago now, Monica, but I just want to point out Dr. Tim West Newman did a huge amount of work on this. Actually, he built this survey online. It used to look like this. It's quite funny looking at it now, because now we've got a completely different looking survey, but the items are still the same. Okay, I want to talk about one student in particular, Dr. Lara Greaves, who is a lecturer in political psychology. Although she's actually a political science, but she was in psychology, and she did her master's with Chris and I, and she did a really interesting thing, Lara, and it kind of changed the shape of the way that I think about the MIFIS now in a lot of ways, or the My scale now. She used latent profile analysis to analyze the to the MIFIS scale, and she was able to extract these 6 different profiles in the population. And we had so many people that had filled it out at this point. We had kind of thousands in our database. And using latent profile analysis, she was able to identify these 6 different subgroups, or she called them identity signatures, and estimate their proportion in the Māori population. So there's these 6 different groups. I'm going to show you another. I know before I show you that, I'll just show you another table. When you look at the way that Māori are often talked about in New Zealand, there is this idea, when you use a label for any group, it's a risky thing, isn't it, really? Because you're kind of implying that they're one homogenous group, like Māori, but people have written that that's not necessarily the case. And there's various ways that they have stated that. So one way that Mason Jury, who's a very, very well-known Māori academic, talked about diversity in the Māori community, is he said, we've got basically these 3 groups. We've got a very enculturated group. So that's a traditional Māori group, tend to be connected. Like this would have been like my grandmother. She grew up in the Māori world, lived in the Māori world most of her life, in her traditional tribal areas, close to her marae, mainly Māori people spoke Māori group. And then you've got this other group that are urban Māori. So grew up in the city, but they're quite familiar with their Māori culture and connected with their tribes at home. So they're happy in both worlds. And then you've got this other group, marginalised Māori, who don't really feel completely comfortable in Pākehā or New Zealand mainstream society as well. So he had 3 groups. Another Māori judge, well-known Māori judge, came along and kind of agreed with those and added another group. And he said there's another group that doesn't really think about themselves as Māori at all. They just think about themselves as Kiwis or New Zealand. But not really connect with that. But they could do if they wanted to, because we'll enable that in New Zealand. Anyone can be Māori if you've got whakapapa, that's fine. If you've got genealogy, we're not exclusive in that respect. But they don't. They want to be Kiwis. And then I had my own groups. My groups were enculturated, so, traditional group. But then I also was interested in a group, I used to call them Renaissance Māori. The Renaissance was late 1970s, after many of the political movements had a really major impact in New Zealand society. Government was recognising Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and basically laws were starting to get strengthened that required institutions of the state to recognise Māori. And these young women had grown up hearing this, knowing this, and learn about the treaty at school, or they learn about it themselves at university, are quite politicised. So I call them Renaissance Māori. And then I also had another group as well, which was the kind of bicultural group. Now, Lara, very, very cleverly really, using the mice, she broke that up even further. And what was great about what she did is she put a kind of estimation of the population that might fall into each group. So I'll show you... this is from Lara's. I kind of changed it a little bit from her original publication, put colours on them here. But you can see we've got these different scales down the bottom here: socio-political consciousness, perceived appearance, etc. And this is the score. So how high do people score on these different scales? And the top group, which we would call probably the enculturated or the traditional group, they're high on all of the scale. And she put that at about 22% of the population, which is kind of smaller than I would have intuitively thought. So, less than a quarter of the Māori population are really traditional. Then she described another group, which is traditional essentialists. So they're really, really comfortable with all aspects of being Māori, score high, but they are likely to say that you have to be Māori a certain way. So they score quite high on that authenticity beliefs scale, which shows why the scale's handy, really, because it shows that there's a group of Māori that actually believes that if you're not Māori culturally, then you're not really Māori, which also is reflected in what some of the women had told me in my interviews, that they felt excluded. Then there's this kind of middle group, the low moderates, and they kind of don't really have strong feelings either way. They're middle of the road. They feel good about being Māori, but they're not really, really into it, but they'll definitely claim that they're Māori. Then you've got a group that's low on everything, but high on spirituality. So that's the way that they connect with being Māori. They believe that they've got a spirit culturally expressing themselves Māori anyway. Then you've got this kind of low on every scale, which is a smaller proportion of the population. So that would be I would say the Kiwis or the New Zealanders that have Māori ancestry but don't really connect to being Māori in any way. So what was interesting about this is, one, the ability to put figures on it and have an estimate of how big these groups might be. And by the way, we keep on finding the same data with new populations as well. We keep on finding the same profiles, which is really amazing. So I think that they're there. I'm just going to flick to this really briefly, because I think the existence of the profiles explains certain things that might be confusing if you didn't have a way of understanding diversity. So we've got the survey called Te Kupenga, which is conducted by the New Zealand Department of Statistics. And what they do is they go to, I think, 5,000. They had 5,000 in 2013. They had 5,000 Māori fill out this form and talk about how they feel about Māori identity. And what you can see here is a slide that shows that only no more than 35% of any age group of Māori would be going to their traditional meeting house in the last year. So there's an idea that Māori need to be connected to their culture to be Māori, but when you look at the data, it shows that a lot of Māori people just don't go there, including me actually recently, because I haven't been for a long time with COVID. But you wouldn't see normally all Māori doing the things that culturally Māori are supposed to be doing to be Māori, including this one. The other one, which I think makes a clearer point, is that this one is a kind of measure of cultural connectedness, and keeping us connected to your culture. And you can see that females find it a little bit more important, but about half the Māori population only found it somewhat or not particularly important, or only a little bit important to be connected to their culture. And I think of ethnic essentialism in New Zealand, one wouldn't normally draw attention to this kind of data, because in order to have a very strong political voice in the 70s and 80s, it was really important to have that kind of strong Māori identity and say, look, this is what we stand for, this is our right. And it's been really important to have that. And I would never question it, to be honest, because I do believe it's important to have that critical element, but it does tend to obscure the diversity within the population in terms of how some Māori really feel. So Lara's excellent work illustrated, I think, and put figures on kind of what might be going on underneath some of this data that shows half the Māori population aren't exactly that focused on their own culture. They're interested in it, but it doesn't necessarily define their lives. And you can see spoken by a lot of Māori people. It's the main language spoken in less than 5% of New Zealand homes. Now, this is a little bit of a different thing, though, because colonisation really did, and assimilation and kind of the loss of land really broke the language up. So Māori might want to speak it, but many don't have access to it. Okay, so getting on to my latest research, and I won't be too long on this, and then we can tie up and go to questions. Anna. So I mentioned that we got this funding in 2018 to do a big survey. We embedded the mice in the surveys, Māori Identity and Financial Attitude Survey. This was really built on that cultural connectionness, predicts financial security for Māori research, because I was really interested in why Māori, who had really high connection to culture, kind of understood it intuitively why, but I wanted to explore it more, that why Māori that were really connected to their culture were likely to say they had a strong sense of financial security, even if they didn't have any KiwiSaver or superannuation. So it was because they were investing in relationships. So let's really look at that quite carefully, because kind of since the late 1980s, there's been a process in New Zealand to start addressing some of the losses under the Treaty of Waitangi, and tribes have put claims to the tribunal, and assets have gone back to Māori to manage collectively. So, large pieces of land, apologies, money. I think there's been about $2.3 billion just in financial terms of assets go back to Māori, probably a lot more than that actually, since 1989. So Māori are actually becoming more influential. They've actually got quite a lot of assets and huge potential, and also known to be very entrepreneurial. So I thought, well, let's have a look at, how this works, how that identity model might fit some of our people. So we sent out this ridiculously long survey in 2018. I say it was ridiculous. It was a really, really long survey. I think that was the biggest feedback we got from poor participants who did fill it out, but it takes a long time to fill out. It's 340 items. But when you do these things, you just really want to get as much information as you can the one time, so you don't have to keep on going back to people over and over again. So sent out a survey. It was actually a pen and paper survey. 7,019 participants filled it out. The response rate wasn't that great, but it was a big enough response rate that we got enough people to, do some really interesting analysis on that data. And like a lot of surveys tend to be weighted towards women, more slightly older age group, 48 years old was the mean, but we did have quite large numbers of people from different age groups to have a look at their responses as well. And I thought I'd just quickly show you just some themes of what the data says in relation to those 6 profiles I mentioned. So with the disassociated profile, many of them said that they felt quite warm towards Pākehā people, less warm towards Māori, or less connected to them. Profile said they were happy to see iwi assets or tribal assets utilised for commercial gain, more likely to see money as a symbol of success, more likely to have more money themselves and live in areas which are not deprived, more likely to feel that New Zealand is a fair and equal place to live, and tend to have closer relationships with Pākehā as partners. Group that might be more towards what I would say a deculturated, more integrated into Māori or into Pākehā society group. And that's just to show you that the profiles that were from the MyFIS data set pretty much matched the ones that Lara had found earlier in 2015. I thought I'd just whip through some of the kind of, that's one of my papers. I won't go into that because I want to see if there's some questions and discussion, but I just want to show you some of the kind of differences with the profiles. That in terms of the group that identifies Māori only, the traditional spiritual and disassociated more like two. So we can see this really quite clear division between Māori that have got two Māori and I guess that would be because of the impact of two culture socialisation practices, but also perhaps their experience of being part Māori in a mainly European society. So this one talks about, we asked them this because we were interested in kind of traditional things that you might do and how much you do them. So going out and getting food from the natural environment, getting it from the sea, kai is food, is quite in my family group. Go out, they go fishing, diving. So I wanted to see if that was influeend by the profiles. We did find that the traditional essentialists and the high moderates, so those that tend to be a bit high on the scales, tend to do these things. Similar pattern, those that were more traditional. Hapu is a sub-tribe, I guess it would be like a clan. And iwi is a tribe. So, how often do you spend time with your hapu and your iwi, not just your immediate family, whānau? And we found that traditionalists more likely to have that kind of broader connection with their tribal links. Oh, this is okay. And this one here, we asked them, how the question was actually for this is one of the questions on the scale was, I would rather take more money. I know if I was offered a job with more money, I'd take it anytime rather than worry about Māori development. That was one of the items on the scale because we're interested in how much they were more likely to think about advancing Māori interests as opposed to their own personal interests. And we found that traditional essentialists were much more likely to say that they would be advancing Māori interests rather than just thinking about themselves, and it kind of decreased. But, a lot of people weren't really, those aren't low scores on that scale because low means more selfish. They weren't low scores where I think maybe people weren't that interested in admitting that. But there was still a difference that we found. And finally, just to make the point that I was saying earlier about the relationship between discrimination and physical appearance, those that reported more Māori ancestry or more committed to Māori more likely to experience discrimination. So these are just some of the more recent ones we've done. We found that cultural efficacy predicts how satisfied people are with their own bodies or Māori are with their own bodies, and also this paper's from one of Chris Sibley's students, Christopher, looked at the relationship between Māori spirituality and the land and found that higher scores on spirituality, Māori were more likely to feel that they were at one with the land. And that's it really. We're still going. I mean, we recently did another 3,000 respondents from the first kind of 7,000 that responded again. We'll probably run the survey again next year. But we're in a situation we've always got all of this data, lots of possibilities for using it. Wakim and I and others have got this really, I think it's kind of a difficult voting paper that I'm not quite sure how I want to frame, and it shows that that those that are less connected to being Māori are more likely to disagree that Māori should have special recognition, and more likely to agree that, or more likely to kind of vote for a National Party in New Zealand, which is primarily a mainstream, kind of slightly more right-leaning party. And we're looking at that paper. It's written out, but I just feel like it needs to be reframed a bit because it's a politically difficult paper. I've got a paper at the moment working on gender differences and Schwartz values used in this survey. And the MIFIS is also used in the NCEA, which is the New Zealand Certificate of Education, which looks at, which is the kind of national system for awarding grades for high school students that can be used with Māori. And it's also been used in other surveys as well. So we've got it. I get requests to use it all the time. In fact, I've got to get another one, respond to someone else today who wants to use it in their research. So that's it really. That's the MyFizz, that's some of the work, quick snapshot. So I'm happy to take any questions, and you can hear that my voice is starting to get a little bit, but I'll be fine to talk a little bit longer.
Wow, Carla, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your presentation. I have many comments I was noting because I like to still write on the old format of the notebook. I have a lot of comments and maybe some questions, and I find it really interesting how you started, but also how you finished, and these reflections, because working with Mapuche people here in Chile, I think a lot of the concerns arise also on the way of integrating methodologies, but I do not want to take time from the people who came and are with us. I'm going to first open the microphone, or if you want to leave us your questions or chat, I will not translate in Spanish for the ones who cannot follow English as easily. Muchas gracias a la profesora Carla, gracias también a todos y a todas ustedes. Creo que es el momento en que pueden enviar sus preguntas, sus dudas, sus comentarios, y en la lengua que les convenga, y nosotros haremos el trabajo de traducirlo. So Carla, we already have a first question and comment in Spanish. Hello, Professor. Excellent work. Very interesting. I would like to know about the consideration of the idea of a survey for the Maori culture, if there was resistance or difference, for example, when you were collecting data about their identity.
Yeah. Well, remember that we'd been warming up to the major survey for a long time. The initial survey that we did, like in 2010, we actually got quite a lot of encouragement from people and feedback like, oh, that was really interesting. And we put that online where they could get the report and they could get a picture of their scales. Obviously, we didn't put anyone's names, but how they compared with other people. So actually, they were okay with it. I would say, though, over time, we have had quite a lot of resistance to it, and fear, I think that's fair as well. But my view's always been that it's a tool, and what we do with the data is probably the most important thing. Out of the second other MyFizz, we did get some quite negative feedback. But we also had 7,000 people fill it out as well. Quite happy to do it with positive comments. So it's not easy doing surveys, and it's probably not my ideal way actually, but they are useful for capturing snapshots and making sure that you can say things that support Māori claims. Like, culture is good for us. Culture is important for children to learn. Children that can learn Te Reo Māori, or adults who speak Te Reo Māori, do feel good about their culture, don't necessarily have to buy into stereotypes about body size, which is one of our latest articles. But in saying that, we have to be really careful about how we use the data. And I mentioned before that we've got this paper, Ken and I and other colleagues, that does say some things that would probably undermine actually the Māori political position, because there is a subset of Māori who don't believe that Māori should have special recognition. I wouldn't just go and put that in the newspaper, that kind of data. So I think what you do with it is really important. The other thing is we make sure that we've got a group of Māori people that manage it now. So I showed you the slide. So at the first one, I got Jason, Mega, Jamie, Nuth, who's in Ngāpuhi, and Kerry Dell and myself. So we collectively hold it and represent the research group. So that does give some standing in the Māori community as well, kind of put out. Plus it's translated in the Māori language. We have videos about why we use surveys on the website. So we do the best we can, but I appreciate that, you know, some Māori people just do not like it. They don't, but we try and balance it by doing other types of qualitative research too.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a comment? ¿Alguien más que quiera hacer un comentario o una pregunta, Carla? Aprovechar yo, también imagino, Joaquín, que tengas algunos comentarios. So I was inviting anyone to leave their questions and comments, and while we don't have anyone, I'm gonna take advantage of my position at the moment. I find it really interesting about your reflection on what to do with the data, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not only for example, my experience here in Chile, and maybe also because I am not Chilean, so and I've seen pros and cons of that specific position as a researcher, because in a way I'm not involved in the social political context in which Mapuche people are still discriminated and there are still problems with the state and so on. But at the same time, I'm also a foreigner. So some things are a bit hard to understand. But one of the things I've really reflected upon while doing research with Mapuche people is exactly that, like the degree to which you can or should be allowed to ask certain questions. And now this can be used for politics. And I remember in a previous project that I had before, that at a certain point, and due to the political context that was there, I would ask people in interviews and then in a survey if people supported violent acts to demand their rights.
Right.
And immediately Mapuche people would say, so you also think I'm a terrorist, right?
Right, yeah.
Because there is this stereotype of the Mapuche as terrorists, that it's just violent and they want to force the state to get their demands. And while you can do it qualitatively, if it's in a survey and people have to either agree or disagree, with I support that Mapuche people can, take violent actions towards social change. And I actually, which is something we shouldn't do in a survey, but after the first people I was surveying in the South, I decided to remove all of the questions related with violence support, because people were really reactive. And by seeing that reaction, I also understood all of a sudden that if I publish something that says, I don't know, 20% of a sample of Mapuche people said very badly interpreted and taken out of context, and as you say, put in the news, or so to delegitimize the Mapuche movement and their demands. So I think your reflection there is very, very, very interesting, and it's not very far from what we're discussing. But then there's also this, and this is what I'd like to ask, because first it was a comment, I'm sorry, is how you balance, right, the need for information, for understanding the specific context, and the ethical balance of actually doing research without undermining the groups and communities that we work with and that we're researching.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the first time we did the big survey, we went on TV. We've made videos. We've really talked about why we would do this, and one of the reasons why I think is that there are a lot of statements around and what the government should do to help Māori people, and and qualitative research, although very helpful to gain deep insights to personal kind of stories and narratives, there wasn't really any large data set specifically on Māori that could prove, substantiate, inform, policies or interventions that really do benefit Māori. So the data is really valuable to prove cause and effects between things. I think that the issue between Māori and not having access to housing equitably is massive in New Zealand. And if you've got a quantitative data that shows these things absolutely clearly in a scientific way, it's, where the power is, it just does really, really help. So I answer it by thinking, in terms of what we do with that data, there's just stuff that I would never extract from the data set. Like I say, and I have a group of people around me, and we say, who is this data for? The other thing is, if any group comes to us and says, can you tell us how many of us filled out that form? What do we, if they want the data, we just give that to them. Not anonymized, obviously, we do the analysis. And saying that, this last time when we did the last round during lockdown, I kind of felt like, I feel that we've done enough for now. I don't feel like there's a desperate it would be just to have the information. So I'm sitting at to my and say, look, what do we feel about the next stages? It's something that we want to do. Because there's still so many good papers that we can get out of it that could be beneficial, that won't require doing it again. Wait 4 years.
It's very interesting because it's also, much the context is quite different. Like in Chile, it's very hard to find, or even to talk about who can be representatives of the different Mapuche communities and people and so on. So if you go and this reflection, me, and it's hard. And I was also very Māori researchers, right? They're mostly qualitative. You have this step into the qualitative. I also think in Chile, especially within psychology, sociology, social sciences, there's you have many historians. You have brilliant Mapuche historians, and that's also very interesting because it's like when they're studying and they're getting their post studies and so on, they really want to take back their story and claim. So I wonder how you see like potential working together. Researchers, right? But they're mostly qualitative, but still I imagine there are, some things to touch upon, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Together.
Well, you say there's a lot about that could be relatively a lot compared to Indigenous in Chile. Mm-hmm. It's a very small community. Most of us know each other quite well, yeah. Particularly in my area. I think I'm always open to collaboration. I collaborate with heaps of people. I mean, a lot of our papers are written with, and what will happen is actually, if I like the body. A Māori researcher, qualitative researcher who specialises in the area, asked them to come in on the paper and help us understand the data, because it's not my area, and I do that with any researchers that have expertise that we don't have. We always reach out together. But just on the, I guess, the environment, Māori, we live in a primarily European environment. Māori people are used to filling out surveys at school, and most Māori people, well, all Māori who speak English feel confident doing that. So I think the survey, it annoys some people, but it's not a completely foreign thing for us to do with our normal lives. With everything really, they used to do crazy. It's kind of normal, and if they didn't want it, they just confident.
Thank you. ¿Alguien tiene preguntas, comentarios? Does anyone have a question or maybe a comment for Carla? I guess Joaquin, you might have.
Yeah. I also have quite a few ideas, and I wanted to chip in, but I'll try to refrain from asking too many questions, because if anyone else wants to use some time, I don't want to take too much on my own. Just to follow up on what you were talking about before, I think one of the main things that caught my attention while working with Carla is that it might be very natural to you in the New Zealand academic context, but it really, I found it fascinating how, for example, Carla and Carla's team, for example, this habit of sharing data and in different spaces and different contexts with different entities, institutions, but also different communities, which is I found fascinating, because it's very nurturing, and it allows you to also see your own data from different perspectives, because you're putting the data out there and sort of reflecting about it. And that's something really amazing that I found from the research project, that, for example, Carla was speaking about a paper that she's been sort of struggling with some ideas. And I find that that's extremely important for us to do, because we have, and this is a work that is something that you mentioned, Anna. It's something that this work is very strong technically. It's super strong in technical terms, but it's always sort of finding a good balance between that technical thoroughness, if you will, and sort of respect for what some call an ethics of concern for the consequences. And that's really important, because it's not just about publishing anything because it's interesting. Even it could be interesting, but it's also quite relevant politically, and it could potentially be exploited by some groups that don't quite understand maybe the story behind the data, and that's something very Carla's team is quite sensitive to that, and I think that's really important. And I think that process is fascinating. For example, I remember attending a Māori, where you presented some of the MIFA's work, and I thought that was amazing. That is really, really cool, and it's something that caught my attention, because it's something that we should be doing more, maybe. And I think that's something that is starting to happen in Chile, maybe, and it's something that maybe less often seen, but it's actually happening, which I see is something really, really good in terms of our academic spaces, which is quite amazing. And in that context, I was thinking about the potential, drawing back from the previous question, the potential exploitation or use of some information. I was thinking about if you have some reflections or even experiences of some times with media and you know or some groups sort of distorting some message. That's something very delicate, and I think it's something we ought to be quite concerned about when we do research like this.
Yeah, I haven't actually had any. I haven't had any negative experiences with anything I presented. Although I do think, because I know within that, you know, I know there's 6 different groups, right? And the Māori, I know the traditionalists. I know this would really annoy them, this kind of research. But then at the same time, I've got quite a lot of people like that in my family, so I understand. You know, I understand. So I guess because I am Māori and I grew up in the Māori world and I know people from every one of those 6 groups and that thing, I guess I tend to be a little bit more confident with some of the things I'll say with the information. I make sure I share it. I do. And when you share, we don't give it, but we represent it. We present it at various conferences. So I'm quite careful with it. I always try to use it in a way that's helpful. And there's lots of things in that data set that would just never see the light of day because I don't think they would be helpful for Māori people. So that has helped, but I mean, never say never, you know, you never know, someone might have an issue with the survey. Oh, actually, there was someone who did complain about the survey way back in 2018, but she was annoyed because some people don't know that you can get the information about their name and address from the electoral roll. So she was angry that we'd approached her sent her a letter, but she wanted to know how we got her address. But no, we haven't had any major negative feedback other than some people don't like getting an unsolicited letter in the mail. So the emails, we don't tend to have issues with those. It's actually the letters that people don't like.
It's very interesting. I think, I don't know how to put it, but I think the New Zealand context and what you're doing, Carla, can be like a really good model to look at and think through how you can implement good research practices that really involve the communities and the people that we're dealing with. I have this feeling that maybe in Chile we're still not there, and it's still very hard, you know, to get there, maybe also because of the social political context, right? Because the situation for Mapuche people is different, you know, and there is a direct conflict with the state. There are violent actions being carried out. You were in the South, but maybe you didn't realize, but it's actually militarized at the moment. There's a state of exception in the South. So it's also very context dependent, right? But I do think that looking at what you are doing with all of your colleagues, it's amazing the amount of people and good ideas that are coming up from all of the collaborations you have and the students that are coming. And I think that's a really good model to look at and think, okay, maybe how could we do this in the future and implement like a good research agenda with many other academics. I mean, this is not a personal project, you know, that really reflect on the realities of the populations, the communities, and that have also, and I really want to thank you for that, this very ethical concern about what the research and its value is.
Thank you so much. I should say that there's a connection also with the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Studies. So a lot of that kind of culture of very broad collaboration sharing and inviting people into projects, working with students. A lot of that comes from Chris Sibley, who was also a really big part of this research initially. So it's a joint project as well. So, and you know, Chris Joaquin, I mean, he's just such a generous person. But I'd love to, yeah, absolutely, Anna. We should talk about, well, I'm going to be here anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, so we can talk more about how
Yes.
yeah, I could share more ideas with you and what you're doing here.
Yes, actually, on Monday for the seminar, we are thinking I have a research assistant, a previous student that is gonna present to you on the challenges of the methodologies with the Mapuche people, for example. So what happened when we started our first surveys in the first project, so we can think what's gonna come next. And it will be lovely to continue this conversation. Maybe also due to time, and I know you should rest as well. If someone else has one last thought or question, si alguien tiene una última pregunta, comentario para Carla. It seems not. Everything was super clear. Well, Carla, thank you so much. We leave it here now. We hope you get some rest and we'll be in touch. Thank you everyone for being here, for also watching us online. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por su asistencia a este seminario. Y cualquier cosa me pueden contactar. O a Joaquín con preguntas, comentarios, algún pedido de literatura. I'm offering that if people want to write to me or Joaquín asking for specific literature from you, that they maybe can do it. Once again, thank you so much, Carla.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone for coming as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carla.
Take good care.